and hello everyone, and welcome to the Silverline Extension Alternatives Analysis public meeting. My name is Reagan Checchio, and I will be the moderator for this evening. I would like to remind everyone for the rules for participating in this meeting, as well as remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded. It is also being streamed on the City of Everett's Facebook page and Everett Cable Access Television. While we wish we were able to do this meeting in person, we're hoping that we have designed an online public meeting that will be interactive and provide an opportunity for us to have a conversation together. Before we can begin that conversation, I want to review a few technical aspects of the Zoom platform. Next slide. We have an interpreter who is translating the meeting tonight into Spanish. If you require these services, please click the interpretation button on your screen, the globe icon, and select which language you wish to hear. At this moment, I will ask all English speakers to please select English as their chosen language. This will allow you to hear translated non-English comments during the Q&A. I would like to introduce our interpreter, Emily Getchell. Emily will provide a welcome and instructions in Spanish.
Buenas noches a todo el mundo, bienvenidos, gracias por unirse a nosotros para la reunión pública del análisis de las alternativas para la extensión de la línea de plata Silverline. Quiero primero ubicarle a la función de interpretación. Si usted desea hoy escuchar esta presentación en español, simplemente ubícase en un momentico cuando se enciende la función, ubícase al fondo de su pantalla, ahí haga clic en el iconito del globo y escoge Spanish. Si desea escuchar la presentación en inglés, tiene de todo modo que escoger English. Si tiene cualquier problema, por favor, comunícase con nosotros tras el chat. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Emily. Next slide. You can view closed captions by clicking the full transcript feature and selecting from the options shown. Show subtitle will display a caption at the bottom of the screen. View full transcript will display the meeting's audio transcription in a window to the right. Next slide. You may use the chat button to submit a typed question or comment at any point during the meeting. We will be monitoring the chat during the presentation, but ask that you hold substantive comments and questions for the breakout discussions that we will be having later. If you have a technical problem, please share your issue in the chat feature at any point during the meeting, and we will respond as quickly as possible. I'll note that all project team staff members are listed with project team next to their names on the participant list. A reminder to everyone that the chat is visible to everyone, and we encourage you to keep any comments in the chat respectful to other attendees. Next slide. Now I will turn it over to Doug Johnson from MassDOT. Doug?
Thank you, Reagan. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Doug Johnson, and I am the project manager for the Silverline Extension Alternatives Analysis. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize elected officials and their staff members in attendance by asking them to introduce themselves in the chat now. We're also joined by Everett Mayor Carlo Di Maria, who has asked to say a few words at the start of the meeting because he has a conflict that prevents him from staying for the question and answer period at the end of the meeting. When we do the question and answer period at the end of the meeting, we will recognize any other elected officials who would like to speak before we open it up to the public. Now I will turn it over to Mayor Di Maria. And Mayor, you should be able to unmute yourself and turn on your camera. And please make sure that you have selected the English language channel in the Zoom settings so that everyone will be able to hear you.
Doug, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
You can, great. But you can't see me, correct?
We can see you.
Oh, good. Okay, excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to to speak this evening and to go out of order. I really appreciate it. So good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank MassDOT Secretary Tesler, MBTA General Manager Poftak, and the Civil Line Project Team for hosting tonight's meeting to discuss the Civil Line extension. As Mayor of Everett, there are a few things more pressing in our community right now than the need for reliable rapid transit. We are less than 3 miles from all of the largest employment districts in Boston, in the Boston region, yet we have not a single rapid transit stop within our city boundaries. As we grow as a city and a region, the residents of Everett and our neighbors in Chelsea, Somerville, Medford, and Cambridge are rightly concerned about equitable access to jobs and education, affordable housing, and a clean and resilient environment. Solving each of these challenges requires many things, but one of the common links between them is the need for a clean, fast, and reliable transit system. One that gives residents access to good paying jobs, and one that allows the development of affordable and market rate housing without adding more congestion and pollution to our streets. I believe it is critical that the Civil Line extension connect the city of Everett to our neighbors in Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, and Chelsea with a one-seat ride. And I want to emphasize to our residents that tonight's meeting is just the first of several opportunities that will be available for public comment and input on how the Civil Line extension will be designed and implemented. I'm encouraged to see so many on the call this evening, and I hope that you will remain engaged throughout this planning process to share your vision of Everett's future. Again, I want to thank MassDOT for doing this evening, continuing to do this. This is so important to our city, to connect our city to a one-seat ride into Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville. It would be truly equitable for our community to have this access. And again, thank you for allowing me to speak out of order. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mayor. We really appreciate you joining us tonight. We'll now move to the agenda. Sorry, one moment. There we go. On the screen is tonight's agenda. After a short presentation, we will be having interactive discussion in breakout rooms to get your feedback, as well as the Q&A period at the end of the meeting. Before we start the presentation, we want to get a sense of the language preferences for the discussion portion of the meeting. We're able to offer an additional breakout room in Spanish if there is interest. I'll now ask Amanda to launch a poll where we will ask you which language you would like to see, or excuse me, participate in the breakout room. We will leave the poll up for a few more seconds to let more folks participate in it. And I think at this point we can close the poll. Thank you very much for participating in that poll. And thank you again, everyone who is joining us on Zoom or watching this on Facebook Live through the City of Everett's Facebook page. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to get your feedback on some potential alternatives moving forward into the next phase of our study. We've identified several potential options to further evaluate for extending Silver Line service from Chelsea into Everett and neighboring communities. And we need your feedback as we move forward with the next steps of that evaluation. Our agenda for tonight includes a brief overview of the study and the work done to date, followed by discussions of the potential alternatives using Zoom breakout rooms. Before we begin the presentation, we want to get a sense of who is here tonight and your interest in the study. Amanda, can you launch the next polls, please? I see that folks are participating in the polls. Thank you for doing that. I will read the questions out loud as well for other folks who are calling in and may not be able to see them. The first question is, which of the following responses describes your interest in this meeting? And unfortunately, Zoom will only allow you to select one answer. So we ask that you select what best fits or best describes your interest in this meeting. I apologize that you are not able to select multiple responses. For the second question, it is, what city do you live in? You'll need to scroll down in that pop-up window to see the second question. And we'd like to know, which city do you live in, whether it's Boston, Cambridge, Chelsea, Everett, Malden, Medford, Somerville, or other. That's a list of cities within our study area, and then other for folks who may live outside of our study area. I think we can now end the poll and show everyone the results. Looks like we have a good number of folks from Everett, Somerville, outside of our study area, some folks in Chelsea, Cambridge, Boston as well. This is really helpful for us because it lets us know where we need to do additional outreach after this meeting. I think we can go to the next slide. And we can go to the next slide after this. This slide shows us the purpose of this study, and I will read it out loud for folks who are joining us by phone. The purpose of the Silverline Extension Alternatives Analysis is to assess the feasibility, utility, and cost of various alignment and service frequency options of an extension of the Silverline, providing high-quality transit from Chelsea through Everett and onto Somerville, Cambridge, and/or Boston. In other words, we're evaluating options for extending Silverline service from Chelsea into Everett and potentially beyond. We're looking at all of the different routes an extension could take and the costs and benefits and other factors for each of those options. Next slide. This slide explains why we are doing this study, and I'll read it aloud as well. This project's overarching objective is to add transit service capacity and connectivity that will knit together Chelsea and Everett with nearby communities that are not currently well connected with high quality transit. You may all be aware of this already, but existing transit service in Chelsea and Everett is not competitive with driving for many types of trips that are being made. Despite the lack of competitiveness, bus ridership in Chelsea and Everett during the pandemic has been more durable than in other communities. Chelsea and Everett have retained some of the highest bus ridership in the system during the pandemic. Chelsea, Everett, Somerville, and Cambridge, as well as other communities, are experiencing rapid growth in housing and employment in areas that are not currently well served by transit. There are existing transit connections in Chelsea and Everett, of course, and to nearby communities that could be leveraged and improved into a high quality, cohesive network. So all of those reasons stated are why we are doing this study. Next slide. We are coordinating with other efforts underway, including the MBTA's bus network redesign, which is part of the Better Bus Project. That effort is looking at existing travel demand within the entire MBTA service area, with the goal of beginning to redesign service over the next 3 years, starting with a phased implementation in the fall of 2022. Bus network redesign is specifically focused on identifying new or underserved areas that merit better transit, given that the region has changed so drastically in recent years, but the bus network has not kept up with that pace of change. So there is considerable overlap between the Silverline extension and bus network redesign, but the Silverline extension study focuses on a smaller geographic area and a longer timeline for implementation, with the purpose of providing a more rapid transit-like service from Chelsea and Everett to neighboring communities. Because of that slightly different purpose and focus, the Silver Line extension and bus network redesign maps, we'll share a map with you later, may not end up looking exactly the same. And of course, we are also coordinating with the ongoing Wellington Circle study, McGrath Boulevard project, as well as many other ongoing efforts. Next slide. This slide shows our study area, which is developed based on the recommendations from prior studies, most notably the Everett Transit Action Plan and the Lower Mystic Regional Working Group report. I'll mention both of those again later. Next slide. This slide shows our project schedule. The vertical pink line shows where we are now. This is our second public meeting for the study, and we are currently developing alternatives to further evaluate this fall. We expect to finish the study in the spring of next year. Next slide. This slide shows the context and events over the past few years that led to this study. Back in 2013, MassDOT and the MBTA launched the Silver Line Gateway study, which led to the creation of the SL3 service to Chelsea. In the past few years, many cities in the Boston area began creating bus lanes to improve bus service, and almost all of the cities in our study area have created transportation plans or comprehensive plans that identify each community's vision and goals for the transportation network, most notably the Everett Transit Action Plan in 2016 and the Lower Mystic Regional Working Group report in 2019. Those studies were the precursors to the Silver Line Extension alternatives analysis, which began at the end of 2020. Notably, both of those studies recommended some kind of extension of Silver Line service from Chelsea into Everett, and we are following onto those studies by figuring out exactly where that extension should go and what it should look like. Next slide. Now we'll walk through the work we've done so far and discuss where we are now. Next slide. Since our first public meeting in April, we have launched an online feedback form through the months of April and May, refined our goals and objectives based on what we heard from the community, both from that public meeting and meetings with our municipal stakeholders. We've completed our existing conditions analysis, which sort of sets the baseline for all of the analysis that we will now do. We created a long list of ideas and evaluated them against our goals and objectives. And then we began to form a short list of alternatives for further analysis. We'll be sharing that short list with you tonight. And I should note that that list is by no means final, still under development, and we want your feedback on it before we get any further into this process. Next slide. We've convened a stakeholder working group for this study to get direct input from municipalities and community members. The group is made up of staff from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council and the cities within our study area. We also have state representatives and senators whose districts overlap with the study area, and community members and community-based organizations that were nominated by mayors and city managers to serve on that group. So that group is providing input throughout the course of the study and meets regularly around key milestones. To date, we've met with that group 3 times as a full body. Those meetings are open to the public, and recordings and presentations are posted on the project website, which is mbta.com/slx. So you can go to the project website and you'll see the list of those meetings. You can click on them and you'll be able to find the presentations from those meetings as well as the recordings from those. That is also true of the first public meeting we had in April, and that is true of this meeting as well. This recording will be posted on the project website in the coming days after this meeting. I also want to note that while the stakeholder working group has met 3 times so far, we've met with staff from our participating cities many more times than that over the course of the study, and we will continue to meet with our municipalities many times between now and the end of the study. We are in regular contact and coordination with all of our municipalities and our study area, both within the stakeholder working group process and in addition to the stakeholder working group process. Next slide. We've also been conducting public outreach throughout the course of the study, including, as I mentioned, meeting regularly with staff from all of these cities. We've held those 3 external working group meetings. We held that virtual public meeting in April. As I mentioned, we also have a project website where we post meeting materials and recordings. We had posted one online feedback form in April, and we have another online feedback form available right now on the project website. That feedback form will be available through October 8th. You can find it by going to the project website. We've also been putting out press releases and email updates about the project to our distribution list. If you don't get emails about this study and you would like to, you can go to the project website and you'll see a link to sign up for project emails. For our public meetings, we advertise them through many different means, including print, radio, and online media in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. We've run ads in the Everett Independent, Chelsea Record, Brazilian Times, and on Super 99.9 FM in Spanish. There is a lot of future outreach planned following this meeting. As Mayor Di Maria mentioned, this meeting is really the start of the next phase of this process and serves as the kickoff of a lot more public outreach that we're going to be doing as we finalize our alternatives before we get into actually analyzing them over the late fall and winter. Next slide. This slide, excuse me, shows our study process. We began by looking at all of the recommendations made by past studies. We screened out the ideas that did not meet our purpose and need, and then we identified all of the potential routes that a silver line extension could take. So that's what you see here in this flow chart between screening and that tier 1 evaluation. That's looking at all of the ideas that had ever been proposed, essentially, and then looking at all of the possible routes that an extension could take. So we evaluated all of the options that we identified in the tier 1 analysis based on our goals and objectives. And then we took the options that performed the best and combined them into full routes from where a service would start to where it would end. The next phase of this study is to evaluate those full routes and compare them against each other to see which provide the most benefit to riders, as well as their potential costs and other factors. If you're interested in learning more about that evaluation process, if you want to get into the details of that analysis, I encourage you to go to the project website and go back and watch the recordings of the stakeholder working group meetings, where we get into the details of our goals and objectives and how they're measured and how alignments ended up scoring in that process. Next slide. I mentioned our goals and objectives. They're really what provide the framework that guide this study. They help us know when we've been successful, and our evaluation criteria nest within the goals and objectives and help us understand which options are more effective than others. Our goals and objectives also have to be consistent with the goals and visions laid out by each community within our study area, as well as the missions of MassDOT and the MBTA, so that anything that we're doing in this study is consistent with the desires and visions of our participating municipalities and fit within the mission of MassDOT and the T. Next slide. To that point, in order to create the goals and objectives for this study, we looked at recently completed plans from our municipal partners. This is a list of the main ones that we looked at, but it is not comprehensive, but it includes MBTA Focus 40, which is the long-term investment plan for the MBTA, various studies from the City of Chelsea, the Everett Transit Action Plan, Go Boston 2030, Summer Vision 2040, and Envision Cambridge, as well as others. Next slide. After reviewing all of those plans and meeting with our stakeholder working group, we developed goals and objectives, and our objectives fit into 5 general categories. They include expanding mobility and access, advancing equity, improving safety, supporting climate change resilience and sustainability, and advancing feasible and implementable solutions. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, we started with a long list of ideas, looked at different paths a Silver Line service could take, evaluated those based on our goals and objectives, And then we're taking the ideas that performed the best and creating a short list of our alternatives. Next slide. Now we'll talk about where we go from here and show you some potential alternatives that we may advance into the next phase of the study. Next slide. Once again, this is our study process. We are starting to get into that tier 2 phase where we'll finalize and then evaluate our alternatives. Next slide. Before we show you some potential alternatives, I want to go over some assumptions that we're making in this process. The first is that Silverline Investments would provide a bus rapid transit level quality of service. As an example, think of the SL3 busway in Chelsea, where the Silverline has its own dedicated space. We're also talking about things like shelters at bus stops, signal priority at traffic lights so that buses can glide through intersections rather than waiting for a long time at red lights, level boarding at bus stops, where when you're standing at the bus stop, you're at the same level as the bus, so you don't have to step up or down to get in, and other features like that that really enhance bus service and make it more like rapid transit than like traditional bus service. So wherever we're looking at potentially extending Silverline service, we're looking at how to get the highest level of bus service possible. On roadways where constraints exist, we are considering trade-offs between general traffic, on-street parking, and transit priority. And where constraints do not exist, we will assume the highest level of transit priority possible. Lastly, stops are going to, on a Silverline extension, are going to be spaced further apart than they are for other MBTA bus routes, because this is intended to be more like rapid transit than like a traditional bus service. Next slide. As we develop our alternatives and service plans, there are several questions we need to answer, including, does it make sense to think about all of these options as an extension of the SL3, or should some of them be a new service like an SL6? If so, we would need to figure out where transfers between those services would occur. We would also need to understand where those services would start and end, whether they are extensions of the SL3 or a new service like an SL6. Lastly, it may make sense to combine some of these alternatives together, especially if it makes sense for some of them to be thought of as extensions of the SL3 and others to be thought of as a different Silverline service. So all of these questions are things that we'll be working to answer this fall as we refine these alternatives and figure out exactly what these are going to look like, or what we would be analyzing. So you'll see on this map that we have identified routes that all start from the end of the SL3 in Chelsea and go to Everett Square, and then on to Malden Center, Wellington, Sullivan, Kendall, and Haymarket. And in some cases, there are multiple options for getting to those destinations. We are still developing these ideas, so they are subject to change. This is not a final list of alternatives. These are the ideas that we are working with right now and will be continuing to refine, in part based on the feedback that we received from you. Ultimately, once we finalize our list of alternatives, we'll be comparing them to each other to see what provides the most benefit to riders, communities, and the MBTA network. Part of the process of developing and finalizing the alternatives is getting feedback from you about which options would best serve your needs and where you would like to see more fast, reliable, frequent transit service. And that is what we'd like to hear from you in our breakout rooms. Before we go to those breakout rooms, I'll note that on this map, some of the alternatives overlap with one another. So this map may be difficult to understand at first, but we will go through the alternatives in our breakout rooms, and we will provide a link to this map so that you can go look at the potential alternatives yourselves and make comments on that map. And our breakout room facilitators will show you how to make comments on this map. For the folks watching this on Facebook Live, I apologize that you'll not be able to participate in the breakout rooms, but we will be posting a link to this map on the project website so that you'll be able to go back and look at the map more closely and post your comments on it if you'd like. Next slide. Our breakout rooms are organized geographically by the two halves of our map. So breakout room 1 will be for discussing routes from Chelsea to the Orange Line, which includes Malden Center, Wellington, and Sullivan. And breakout room number 2 will be for discussing the routes from the Orange Line to Kendall and downtown Boston. As I mentioned, a link to the map shown here will be posted in each breakout room, and you'll be able to provide comments on the map using the link, or you'll be able to leave comments or make comments to the breakout room facilitator, who will then take your comment down during the breakout room session. Members of the project team will be there to answer any of your questions about the map, show you how to leave comments on it if you'd like to, or if you prefer not to just take your comments and answer any questions. Next slide. I'm now going to turn it over to Reagan Checchio, who will explain how to get into the breakout rooms.
Thanks, Doug. So the interactive discussion is originally designed to be 30 minutes, although we might have some extra time, and I will verify that with you all before we break for breakout sessions. But let me first do the directions. So when we give you the prompt, you will see an icon on Zoom that says breakout rooms. You click that in your meeting controls. We also are going to allow folks at the halfway point to switch breakout rooms. So each breakout room will have an assigned group leader who will introduce him or herself, lead the discussion, and will advise you when you're at that halfway point, so that if you wanted to switch at that point, you can. I'll also note that the breakout sessions are going to be recorded, but only for note-taking purposes. They are not part of the meeting recording that will be shared online. Also, the Facebook Live will be paused while we are in breakout sessions. So I wanted to note that as well. Group leaders are going to be taking detailed notes in the sessions, though, and that's going to be incorporated into a written summary of the meeting. You will click the breakout rooms icon in your meeting controls, and this will display the list of open breakout rooms. You will then click join next to the room you wish to enter, then confirm by clicking join again. To exit a breakout room, you will click leave breakout room. Be careful to only leave the room, not the meeting, and because it will take you back to this main room. If you want to switch between rooms, you will click that breakout room icon again when you're in the room and choose the room that you would like to go to. So you will be able to move freely through the breakout rooms or back to this main session. If you are having trouble switching between breakout rooms, you have a few options. In the breakout rooms themselves, you can select call for help, and a staff member will come and provide assistance in the chat. Or you can always choose leave breakout room and return to the main session, and a staff member can assign you to your preferred session. I did get some confirmation that we still are going to be speaking for in breakout rooms for a half an hour. So it's 6:35 by my clock now. So I think what we will do is probably reconvene here at 7:05. Doug, does that work for you? Doug is nodding at me, so that sounds good. And if you are joining the meeting by phone, we will have to assign you to a room manually. So I will invite the group leaders and attendees to choose their breakout rooms now. And if you have any trouble joining a room, please type in the chat which room that you would like to join, and a staff member will assign you. And we will see you back here at 7:05. And I think you can start the recording.
All right. Welcome back to the main room, everyone. Thank you for participating in our breakout rooms. And I hope that the discussion in those rooms was informative and that you had your questions answered and you had the opportunity to comment on the remix map. There was one question that came up in one of the breakout rooms that I wanted to address for everyone. Somebody asked if they or we were just picking one route. And I want to clarify that as we develop the alternatives, we need to figure out how different options would interact with other services and if any of our alternatives should actually be combinations of some of the options that you saw on that map. So that's something that we will be figuring out over the next 2 months as we finalize those alternatives and then move them forward into the next stage of our analysis. I think we can go to the next slide.
Doug, if I can interrupt, people
Please.
may need to switch their language channel again if they are back from the session to that English language channel. It disabled it for some people so everyone can hear questions. So if you look at the globe icon, I would just ask everyone, make sure that English or Spanish is selected at this point. I'm sorry for interrupting.
No problem. Thank you, Reagan. I just realized that I also had to do that. So it's possible that some folks weren't able to hear what I was just saying, but hopefully everyone did. Essentially, thank you all. Welcome back into the main room. We hope you enjoyed the discussion and we appreciate you participating in it. Before we go to general Q&A with the public, we are going to go through next steps. So we can go to the next slide. As I mentioned earlier, this meeting really serves as the kickoff for the next phase of the study, where we will finalize our alternatives and then evaluate them over the fall and winter. That process will include more public outreach and meetings with our municipal stakeholders. So you can expect to hear more from us, to get more emails from the project team, see us virtually, most likely, doing more outreach and trying to engage with you to get more feedback as we continue to develop those alternatives. So between now and October 8th, we ask that you fill out our online feedback form, which is available on the project website, mbta.com/slx. The online feedback form is very similar in the feedback it's looking for, very similar to the map that we directed everyone to. We just know that some folks would rather provide their comments through a form. Some folks would rather actually see it on a map to have a better understanding of what these routes are that we're talking about and where they would go. So we want to provide both of those options to everyone, but regardless of whether you provide comments on the map or the online feedback form or both, we'll receive all of your comments and we will take it in as we continue to refine our alternatives. We anticipate having our next public meeting in the winter to share the results of our analysis, but as I mentioned, you will hear from us between now and then. Next slide. Now I'll turn it over to Reagan.
Thanks, Doug. So we want to give you all an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have now that you maybe did not get a chance to address in the breakout sessions. I will note before people start raising their hands and things, I'm going to go through the instructions as to how we're going to accept feedback, and then I will cue you when it's time to raise your hands, etc. So next slide, Shayna. So if you would like to share a comment or ask a question, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your typed question or comment. We'll alternate between reading questions and comments and recognizing those who want to pose a question verbally. I would ask you to be brief so we can hear from as many people as possible. If you do want to share a question or comment verbally, you can press the raise hand button. You will see that usually under the reactions in your Zoom controls. For those who are joining on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing star and the number 9. All attendees who speak Spanish, please raise your hand to provide your comments and questions verbally so the interpreters can hear and repeat your comments. When we recognize your name, you will be unmuted and then you may speak. After you share your comment, we will lower your hand and then you will be returned to the muted state. Before we open the comment and question session to the public, we'd like to invite any elected officials in attendance or their staff to ask questions or make comments. Please use the raise hand feature so we can recognize and unmute you. So please do that now. And I am not seeing any raised hands, and I know we already heard from the mayor this evening. So with that, I will invite members of the public to give your thoughts now. And again, you may use the chat feature or the raise hand. So I know some folks are having trouble finding the raise hand icon. It's a little smiley face and a plus sign in your Zoom controls at the bottom. It says reactions. There's an option to raise hand there if that's helpful. Or you can always submit something in the chat.
Hey, I had 2 questions. Is that okay? The host unmuted me.
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble. Please feel free.
Hey, so I guess first a quick comment. Thank you for putting this all together. I think this is a very good proposal. 2 questions I have. Do all the proposed routes have right-of-way for dedicated bus lanes? And then second question is, are there any special winter resiliency plans required for bus routes? I know, we've been having some trouble with trains in the winter. How would that be different for this rapid bus transit? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. To the first question about dedicated right-of-way, the transit accommodations that we'll be able to achieve in our alternatives will really vary from alignment to alignment, or basically from roadway to roadway. So on some of the stretches that we're looking at, we have already identified the ability to implement bus lanes in both directions. In some cases, we have options for side running bus lanes, in other cases for center running bus lanes. But there are some other corridors that are more constrained and where we need to assess sort of what the impacts of transit accommodations would be and what the trade-offs would be of reallocating that road space. So in some corridors, it's very easy. In other corridors, it will be more of a challenge. And that's something that over the next 2 months, we're going to be working through with our municipal partners to identify for every roadway what level of transit accommodations we would assume could be provided within the existing right-of-way, or if there are options for widening right-of-way in some cases to allow for those transit accommodations. So that's something that we're still evaluating, and we're looking at every single roadway in all of our alternatives to figure out what could potentially be provided. For the question about winter resilience, the answer is similar to the first question. It sort of depends on the roadway in use, the jurisdiction, who is responsible for winter maintenance. So it kind of depends. Obviously, the SL3 busway in Chelsea is different than locally owned roadways in our different municipalities. So that is something that we will have to consider in our alternatives. Whose jurisdiction is the roadway in? What is their plan for winter maintenance? How has that been handled in the past? And that will factor into our analysis as we consider reliability of any of these services. I hope that answered your question.
Thanks, Doug. I will note that I think we'll go to Jay, who has his hand up. There's a few questions in the chat, and I also know that there are some questions from some of the breakout rooms that we can also go to after that, if that works for everyone. So Amanda, can you unmute Jay?
Thanks, Regan and Doug. So Jay Monte here. I'm the Director of Transportation for the City of Everett. I just wanted to address Adam's question in a little more detail, because I think in a lot of these cases too, it's going to be down to the municipality to determine kind of where and how bus priority is achieved on some of these roadways. So just to give you an example, in Everett, on 2nd Street, where we're seeing a lot of new development being permitted, we're actually requiring new projects to give an additional 15 feet of right-of-way on 2nd Street to accommodate a future busway. And to date, we have 3 or 4 projects that have already committed to doing that. We'll build it out in the next couple of years. And that covers about 25 or 30% of the corridor, which, you know, still a long way to go, but actually that 30% that we've gotten is some of the most critical pieces too. So, so we're going to work in that direction and hopefully get more, but, you know, we'll work with what we have in that case. You know, Lower Broadway, you know, we'll be working with future developers who may develop across the street from the Encore Casino to do the same thing, right? So how, you know, if we need to add space to add bus lanes, we're going to take that that option to do that. And then other things we've done in the past, you know, we've put in the bus lanes on Upper Broadway. We just last year did the bus lanes in Sweeter Circle. Those will actually allow us to, you know, we can better utilize those as part of the Silver Line too. So we're doing a lot. I know my friends in Somerville and Chelsea are doing a lot as well, kind of in that same vein. And so we're trying to get ahead of the curve a little bit here and plan ahead to make sure we provide adequate priority for future Silver Line.
I had to get myself off mute. Thank you, Jay. So I know there's a comment or a question in the chat and about shuttle bus service, but I think it's mostly about late night service. Doug, if you just wanted to clarify for the wider group that it's whether or not we're going to be considering late night service as part of this project and current service.
Sure, great question. One of the things that we have to do for all of these alternatives as we develop them is figure out exactly what the span of service would be. So when it starts, like when in the morning it starts, when in the evening it ends, and we'll be looking at different options for span of service for these alternatives, as well as service frequency, like how frequently the service will be running, what kind of headways it will have. And part of that is also figuring out what the fleet requirements of any of these alternatives would be, how many buses would need to be procured in order to make any of these alternatives a reality, as well as staffing needs, how many bus operators would be needed to operate that service over any given span of time and any given frequency. So these are all details that we have not figured out yet, but will be figuring out over the next 2 months in order to compare the different alternatives against each other and have a better understanding of what exactly would be needed or what it would actually take to implement any of these alternatives.
Great. And then I know there's a question from Ellen Reisner about the degree of attention given to future needs for the proposed Silver Line alternatives rather than current needs.
Yes, Ellen, if I misunderstand your question, I ask that you please clarify it. But my understanding of your question is that you're wondering about future demand for transit services versus current demand. And I will say that in our analysis, we are looking at current population distribution within our study area, current employment, where affordable housing is currently located, all of those factors and other demographics as well. We are also looking at future conditions and what we expect them to be when a service would actually be implemented. So to the point that Jay Monte has made a couple times in this meeting, there are areas within our study area that are experiencing rapid development where lots of new housing is being built, both market rate and affordable housing, and where new employment centers are emerging, where there will be demand for transit service to and from those places. So we're looking both at the current demand and at what we expect the future demand to be based on the development that we know is already in the pipeline from our municipalities and what additional development could potentially come down the line based on zoning and other regulations within our study area. So we're looking at both of those things. And we want to make sure that we provide service that accommodates the needs of existing riders while also is looking towards the future and accommodating the future demand that we anticipate seeing.
Thanks, Doug. So I'm going to do Marie's question. I think Dan's question was already addressed by your span of service. That span of service is one of the considerations we'll be looking at. Then I think we're going to go to some of the breakout questions, and then Wig, I'll turn to you at that point. So the other question in the chat is, are traffic flow improvement studies part of this plan?
And the answer is yes. As we develop our alternatives and figure out what exactly roadway conditions would look like for the alternatives, we will be doing traffic analysis to see what kind of impacts could be expected of some of the changes that we could potentially make to some of the roadways and intersections. One of the things we're also going to be evaluating in this process is what the possibility for mode shift is of any of these alternatives. In other words, if we were to implement any of these, we want to know how many people we could potentially shift from single occupancy vehicles onto transit service by providing the new service. So that's something that we're able to assess via travel demand modeling. And that is part of the next phase of our process. Once we develop the alternatives, we'll conduct that analysis to get that sense of how much mode shift we could potentially see through the realization of any of these alternatives.
Thanks, Doug. Teresa, I'm going to turn to you. I think you said there were some questions that came up in the chat of your breakout session that we might want to address.
Hi, yes, there were a couple of questions that were posted on the remix map during the breakout sessions that I think would be helpful for Doug to answer. The first that came in was, would the Silver Line use the bus area being built as part of the new Lechmere station or a separate platform?
We right now are anticipating that in our alternative that goes to Kendall Square, we are going to assume that the buses would drop folks off and pick folks up right underneath the station. So in the Lechmere station plans, there is a bus loop, which you may be referring to, but there's also bus stops directly underneath the station that provide direct access into the Green Line station. So the path that we've evaluated or are evaluating for our connection to Kendall Square would be able to drop folks off and pick folks up underneath the station. It wouldn't be necessary to circulate through that bus loop for our alternative from what we can tell so far.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, these alternatives tend to run parallel to existing incoming Orange and Green Line service. I'm curious why there aren't alternatives that instead complement rail, such as an XLX connecting Wellington, Davis, and Harvard. If rail is currently the spokes of transit, we need the wheel that, in parentheses, urban ring that connects the spokes.
That's a great comment. It is, you're right. It is the case that some of our alternatives do run parallel to some of these services. I think even within some of the alternatives, it's actually a mixture of both though. For example, Silver Line extension to Wellington, that is essentially the wheel to the spokes that you described. I should also note though that bus network redesign is looking at reevaluating the entire bus network and realigning the existing bus routes to better serve existing demand for transit service And in some of the cases that they're looking at, their new network could potentially provide some of those wheel connections, as you described them, to complement those spokes. So we are working with the bus network redesign team to understand their process and the ultimate recommendation that they will make for a new bus network. And as that gets refined and further developed, we'll be sort of reevaluating some of the assumptions that we've made in our study to ensure that we're responding to what is being proposed in bus network redesign rather than what would then be the old bus network by the time the Silver Line extension could be implemented. So we're engaged with that process to understand the work that they're doing. And I think the question that you asked is one that is being thought of and evaluated through the bus network redesign process, as well as this one.
Thank you. And I think just one more question, and I appreciate that people are still putting in their comments on the remix map. This is very helpful, so thank you. But one last question before we turn it back. Will all of these routes support catenary for electrification of the Silver Line extension? If not, alternatives where that is possible should be prioritized?
That's a good question. Thank you. We haven't figured out exactly what the fleet assumptions would be for these alternatives, exactly the type of vehicle that would be operating on these routes. So that is something, in addition to a lot of the other details that I've mentioned, we need to work through over the next 2 months. That's something that we need to consider as well and figure out what that future fleet would look like on any of these services. That's something that we will be working with the MBTA fleet and facilities teams to figure out so that we can work that into our analysis.
Thanks, Doug. So I think, Wig, you will get to be the last question of the night. So Amanda, can you unmute Wig for us? Thank you for your patience, Wig.
Yeah, no problem. I'd like to just emphasize the importance of keeping in mind big vision alternatives, if not for the early parts of this, but longer term for the region, and would start by pointing out that I think about 80% of the opportunity zones are in the lower Mystic and up to Lynn, which is an underserved area, intensely environmental justice area. And secondly, by pointing out that the future life sciences axis is clearly going to be Longwood to Harvard, Alston to Kendall. It will be a super corridor. And let me just suggest one alternative for people to think about, maybe modify. You know, what if you took the blue line and you extended it down a green line corridor to Longwood, and then you tunneled under the road at Longwood to Harvard, Alston, and then you picked up Grand Junction, you ran through Kendall, you ran through the old industrial areas of Somerville, and then across on Grand Junction, all on Grand Junction, which exists now, and across to the north side of the Mystic, which really needs to be folded into the Boston and Cambridge economy that was started by the massive amounts of subway and light rail investments, primarily into Boston and Cambridge following the Boston Transportation Plan Review in the 1970s. And then you curl around to Chelsea and you pick up the blue line. And if possible, you do a small loop into Lynn, at least picking up the GE complex, which is a massive amount of spare acreage. That would be massively more sustainable than what we're talking about tonight. And it would fully meet the efficiency needs and the scale needs of climate response in Eastern Massachusetts. So I would just ask people to think about that kind of thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Wig. So I wanted to say we appreciate all the input tonight, and Doug, I will turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Reagan. I think we can go to the next slide. Thank you all very much for participating in this public meeting. We really appreciate your time and the input that you've provided to us. If you have additional questions and comments, we ask that you email us. The project email address is on the screen, slx@mbta.com. I also mentioned that the online feedback form is available through October 8th. We ask that you go to the project website, fill out that form. We'll also be posting the map for folks to continue to leave comments on there. So we ask that you check the project website in the coming days for the materials from this meeting, as well as that map. You will be hearing from us again in the coming weeks, and you can expect our next public meeting to be in the winter of 2022, but we hope to engage with you before then. Thank you all very much for your time and have a great night.